Hey, how's it going tonight? So if you're watching this in video form, I'm gonna apologize in advance for that gnarly light coming at you. It's just something that you're gonna have to deal with. You can plug me into an iPod and listen to me that way if it makes it better and you don't have to stare at me all night. So this is the start of a new video series that we're gonna be doing. Compliments of my little brother. He wanted us to get a little bit more material on the website, and so each week we're gonna be talking about the gospel, particularly rendered from the Catholic Church and the readings that precede it, but I think that we'll find it to be applicable to all our circumstances day in and day out. So today we're going to be discussing exclusively Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35, and it's the arrival of Christ on the road to Emmaus. So, a little bit of background on this road headed to the town of Emmaus. Emmaus was located about 7 miles north of Jerusalem, and if you were to go on Google Images right now and look for the road to Emmaus, what you'd see is desolate dirt road. But the fact of the matter is that in the context of when we're hearing about this from the lips of Luke, what we understand is that this road to Emmaus actually would have been quite crowded. And the reason for that is that the Passover festival has just occurred. And the Passover festival is actually one of the holidays in the Jewish religion that back then required a pilgrimage, right? And so during the Passover, people actually made the trip to Jerusalem, right? And where do they come from? They came from all these surrounding towns, right? Emmaus being one of those towns. Well, these disciples were headed back to Emmaus, probably to return to their livelihood in a big way, right? And it was here that Christ arrived to them. Now, something else to note about the road to Emmaus is that they were certainly not alone on this road. Based on the notion of this concept of the pilgrimage, there would have been tons of people headed back to Emmaus. Families pushing carts, carrying luggage, who knows what. But these two travelers certainly would not have been by themselves as Christ arrived to them. Now, what's particularly fascinating about the arrival of Christ in these circumstances is that he is not recognized. And actually, the language here is kind of fascinating and a little bit ambiguous, but what we understand is that Luke tells us that the disciples were kept from recognizing Christ. Now, if we delve a little deeper into this, we come to see that this could probably have three different meanings, and it in part probably takes from each of these meanings. First and foremost, Christ wouldn't have been recognized in a physical sense. What we have to keep in mind is that the last time that the disciples, these two disciples that we're discussing, saw Christ was when he was beaten, tattered, and torn up on the cross, right? And so the Christ that they would have expected to see was one with remnant burial cloth, with cuts and bruises and lashes, holes in the hands, right? And so to see a Christ in his glorified form would not have been anything that they expected, right? Especially because their savior, as far as they understood, was dead. Sure, he had gone missing, right? And we come to find that they tell this person, this vagabond who's walking next to them, about the events that have unfolded. And in fact, they like spurn him because they're like, do you not understand what has been happening in Jerusalem? Like, stuff has been crazy, right? But nonetheless, they would have been expecting a Messiah most likely very different in a physical nature from the Messiah that they see, right? Second of all, we can probably entertain this notion a little bit that Christ prevents the Messiah, these people from recognizing him as the Messiah, right? In a way, he's disguised, or he is kind of like behind the veil of sorts. And this is again because this road most likely would have been pretty crowded at the time, and there would have been a great deal of fervor surrounding this situation. So if they had recognized Christ off the bat and had been like, oh my gosh, this is amazing, our Messiah, things would have got wild like that, right? People who had followed Christ would have been clinging to him, looking at the resurrected form of our Savior, right? And those people who had been loyal to the Jewish factions that had crucified Christ, they would have been in upheaval, right? Because it would have created entire chaos. And that's not what Christ wanted in those given circumstances, right? And finally, we have to entertain this notion that probably isn't looked at or examined closely enough. And it's this notion that the disciples were kept from recognizing Christ by themselves. And I think that this happens day in and day out in our regular lives. Christ is all around us. The work of God is all around us, and we constantly fail to recognize it. And it's not because it's not screaming in our face. It's not from some notion of physicality that changes or the fact that Christ exists behind this veil, but it's because we have our eyes closed to what and who Christ is. So every time that flick someone off that cuts you off on the highway, or you say something bad about someone who went behind your back, how do we know that we're not saying these things about Christ? And you might be asking yourself, well, that's kind of like ridiculous notion. Why would Christ cut me off on the highway? And all I would say is, let us not be the first ones to think that we are not going to be tested when Christ arrives, right? His entire ministry was a series of tests, right? The man spoke in parables, right? How much more educational and formative does it get than that? Right? And he does these signs and he tested the people. Were they going to recognize him for who he was? And the fact of the matter is that they didn't recognize him for who he was, right? And they didn't recognize him for who he was because they were expecting him to be somebody else. When they had this image of the Messiah, the Mashiach, the Savior, it was very different than the person that Christ was or the person that Christ came to them as, right? And so what did they do? They rejected him. And this is a very valid fear in our own lives. Have we built up, or even this image of Christ, or bounded him in such a way that if he were to come, we wouldn't recognize him because he's not the Christ that fits into the mold that we think he should fit into? And if that's the case, then we need to radically change what we are doing in our lives. And we need to proceed a lot more cautiously. Because when we are on our own personal road to Emmaus, we cannot be walking with our head down. We cannot ignore the people around us. We cannot fail to see Christ in our lives because the second that we do that, he is going to come and go, right? And we see it in the disciples because after he talks to them and then they recognize that it is him finally, they turn to each other and they're like, oh my gosh, didn't we feel a burning in our hearts regarding this matter? And how often in hindsight do we recognize a burning in our hearts? Do we recognize a presence of Christ after it is too late? And so, what I'm encouraging you to do is pick up your head and open your eyes and act now. Find Christ now and treat the people that are Christ in your life accordingly. Because if we fail to do so, if we fail to recognize Christ, then we will be subject to the greatest irony that history has ever known. Christ came a first time for God's chosen people, and he wasn't the Messiah that they were expecting, and they turned him away and they put him on the cross, right? And how tragic would it be if we met the same fate? If Christ came again and we thought he was going to be someone else and we turned our back and we persecuted him. We can't allow that to happen to us. So know that Christ is everywhere and everyone, and open your eyes today. Do not be the thing that stands in your way of recognizing your Savior, because he will test us. He did test us, and he'll certainly do it again. And he will ask that we recognize him. He will say, who do you believe that I am? And it's in that moment that we're going to have the right answer, that we're going to have our eyes open, and that we're going to have to know that Christ is there and Christ is real, and we are going to have to accept him into our lives. And we're going to have to act in such a way that shows that we've accepted Christ into our lives. So walk forward with a renewed vigor, walk forward with open eyes, walk forward with your head held high, and be looking for Christ.